So let's dive in. So today's webinar will be focusing on the question of non-commercial pharmaceutical R&D and what can we learn from PDPs about costs and efficiency. As I mentioned, the presentation will be done by Marcela Vieira, who was the lead researcher on the research project that will be presented, and she's also the project coordinator of the Knowledge Network, of which this series is a part. Next slide, please. So the Knowledge Network has a goal of maximizing the contributions of research and analysis to globally equitable innovation and access to medicines. And the point of these webinars is to facilitate a two-way flows of knowledge between the research and policy and practice communities. You can find a lot of our, all of our webinars actually on the Knowledge Portal website. You see the address here on the screen. At that website, we also have a wealth of information, which is all available open access, providing summaries of the existing state of the academic literature on a whole range of policy issues relating to pricing, intellectual property, and innovation. We also have data sources and most recently new information on COVID-19 vaccines. So I encourage you to check out some of the resources there. Before I forget, which I always do at the end of the webinar, I did want to flag that the next webinar in the series will be about 1 month from today, April 29th, same time in Geneva time. Our speaker will be Monica Balasegram, the executive director of GARD-P, and the discussant will be Michelle Childs, who's the director of policy advocacy of DNDI, the Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative. And they'll be presenting and discussing a recently published report drawing lessons from the COVID-19 experience and what those lessons might mean for antibiotic resistance and the development of new antibiotics. I just wanted to remind everybody this webinar is being recorded. We will post this afterwards on the website. We do welcome questions from participants at any time. Please type them directly into the chat and make sure you select to all panelists and attendees. You can also raise your hand if you want to pose your question orally. If you don't select that, the question only comes to us and everybody else can't see it. So please do remember to select all panelists and attendees. After the webinar ends, we'll ask you to fill out a very short survey, which is anonymous. The feedback is very useful for us to improve the webinars over time, and we take your suggestions very seriously. Any suggestions for topics you can send to the email address that you see on the screen. Okay, now for today's topic. We were motivated to do this study because there's growing interest in alternate business models of research and development, particularly to address big challenges in the current pharmaceutical system, such as high prices, unmet innovation needs, and limited availability. And certainly in the current pandemic, we don't need any further reminders of the challenges that we're facing. There has been significant experimentation in alternate business models, particularly in the area of neglected diseases, where it's long been recognized that the mainstream traditional business model would not deliver and would not be expected to deliver. Many of these alternate business models, including PDPs, have demonstrated that it is feasible to develop new medicines. We have now about 20 years of experience and evidence, but to date, we have not had a good understanding of how much these R&D processes cost and how efficient they are, especially when we compare these to averages coming from the commercial R&D sector. So this is really the key question that this study focused on. Before I give the floor over to Marcela, who will be presenting, I just wanted to also flag that a second co-author of this report, Ryan Kimmett, should be recognized and credited. He was a student here at the Graduate Institute, graduated and went on to greener pastures, but also has made very important and valuable contributions to this study. And I also wanted to flag that we try not to be too self-promotional. We don't present too much of our own research in this series, but certainly I thought this study is really timely. I thought the findings were really interesting, and The full working paper is 100 pages. And so for those of you who may not wish to go through 100 pages, I think that a webinar is a great format to try to communicate the key findings to allow for discussion. And the last reason I would highlight is that this is a very complex subject. I think it's a subject that we struggled to try to explain clearly what our findings were. And we thought that a webinar format would be a great way to supplement what's already available in written format in the full research report and in the article that was distributed along with the webinar announcement. The article that's been published as a preprint on the F1000 journal website. One last comment actually on the status of the article. It is a preprint. It is currently undergoing peer review. So any of the comments or questions that you raise in the webinar will be very useful for us as we move to finalize that article. So without further ado, let me give the floor to Marcela Vieira. I already gave you her title. She is one of the most knowledgeable researchers that I know working on innovation policy and research and development. And she has really been the driving engine behind this study. She's a lawyer by training with, I think, about 15 years now of experience working on innovation and access to medicine. So Marcela, over to you. She'll be presenting for about the next 20-25 minutes, and then we'll open up for Q&A.
Well, thank you so much, Suri, for your kind words and also for the introduction of the study that we are going to be presenting today. As Suri mentioned, the study was led by herself, myself, and Brian Kimmett, and you can find the full findings also openly available at the links we share with you before the webinar. So just a few declarations before diving in. This received funding from the WHO TGR Special Program for Research and Training in Tropical Diseases, and also from the Swiss National Science Foundation. And Suri was Secretary of the Board of Directors of the Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiatives, the NDI, during the time of this study, which is one of the PDPs active in neglected diseases research. Suri already mentioned the background. I just wanted to highlight that we managed to find in the literature a couple of studies that provides data on costs, timeframes, and attrition rates for specific non-commercial R&D initiatives and projects, but we did not find any analyzing more than one initiative. You can find our literature review on those studies also available in the full research report. So we decided to conduct this study responding to a call from the TGR to use the P2I model tool, which I'm going to explain briefly in the upcoming slides, to improve the understanding of how the costs, timeframes, and attrition rates of non-commercial R&D initiatives compare to commercial R&D initiatives using the averages from this specific model. It should be said that our study population includes more than PDPs, as other organizations are also active in the neglected diseases field for non-commercial purposes, but most of the actors active in this field are PDPs. Just a few definitions. We use non-commercial to classify initiatives that are undertaken primarily with a not-for-profit purpose. They are usually the lead organizations, and they can be academic or governmental in nature, or non-profit PDPs. For-profit firms usually do play a role in these initiatives, but they are not the lead organizations of these projects. And we prefer to use non-commercial rather than non-profits, because a developer may earn some profits or revenues on a product as a way to offset some of the costs, but it's not their main purpose for conducting R&D. So the study design, as I already mentioned, we used literature reviews to compare, both to analyze what was already available in the literature in terms of non-commercial R&D initiatives, but also to see other estimates available for commercial R&D initiatives on cost, timeframes, and attrition rates, to be able to compare to the averages that are included in the P2I model that we used as parameter of comparison, and I'm going to explain why in a few minutes. And we also collected two kinds of original data. Quantitative data, associated with individual ING projects managed by non-commercial ING initiatives. So we collected that through our written questionnaire that's available as an annex in the full research report. And we also collected qualitative data based on interviews with non-commercial ING initiatives and or experts on such initiatives to explain the data and reasons why this might or might not differ from commercial ING. We started by selecting our study population based on a database of pipeline technologies for neglected diseases development developed by Duke University and Polysecures Research. We contacted 48 non-commercial ING initiatives. You can find a list of the organizations contacted in the full research report. And we received quantitative data from 8 organizations and qualitative data from 12 organizations. The data was collected between June and September 2019, and it was aggregated and anonymized for publication. So I'm not going to explain in details the P2I model. It's available, publicly available in open journals, a better explanation of the tool. But as we are using this as parameter for comparisons to our own data sets, I think it's important just to highlight a few features of this model. So it was mainly set to predict which products could be expected to reach the market from existing neglected diseases pipeline, and also to estimate the associated costs to bring those products to the end of the ING process. And to do that, it has a number of underlying assumptions, especially on costs, timeframes, and attrition rates from preclinical to phase 3. These assumptions, they are derived from historical data on health product development on all diseases, not only neglected diseases. It was built on over 25,000 data points, originally from the Parexel's RNG cost sourcebook, and then was further refined and validated by interviews. We assume that the majority of the data used to construct the P2I averages comes from commercial ING, as non-commercial ING, especially at the late stage product development, is both relatively recent and small in scale. So we estimate it was possible to separate the data according to product developers, but it wasn't. So we just assume that this comes mostly from commercial ING, and we use this as parameter for comparison. It's also important to mention that the P2I model works based on different archetypes and technology types, and there are different assumptions for each one of these types, such as vaccines, new chemical entities, biologic drugs, and diagnostics. So it's not all the same. The assumptions are not the same for all archetypes. As I mentioned, we did conduct a literature review to try to see what other estimates were available for RNG costs, timeframes, and attrition rates beyond the ones in the P2I model. And here is a bit what we found. So it's important to highlight that especially for costs, there is a wide range of estimates available in the literature, and it varies a lot. So here on the top, we can see some of the very much cited studies that actually include averages much higher for costs than the ones that are in the P2I model. That's actually down here. But the P2I model is in line with some of the other studies also available in the literature. So it's fair to say that it's representative, and based on the number of the data points that they used, that's actually representative of historical RNG data for all product developers. There is less variation for timeframes and attrition rates, so I'm not really going to go this into details. We're just leaving it here for reference. And now I'm going to actually dive in our study. So for the data collection, for the quantitative data, we used a combination of data that was provided by the respondents themselves with public available information, especially for timeframes. We anonymized all the data and combined by product archetype, but due to limitations in your data set, the analysis was limited to only one type of technology, that is drugs. We excluded vaccines and diagnostics, and also to only 2 of the P2I archetypes, new chemical entities simple and new chemical entities complex. This is some of our findings. I'm going to present first the quantitative data and then the qualitative data for each of the cost, timeframes, and attrition. It was not always so easy to classify the products that was part of our data sets into the archetypes. So we tried separating in NCE simple and NCE complex, but we also did a sensitivity analysis to try to see how it would compare when we combine the 2 types of drugs. And then what we see is that our collected data combined, which is the one here in darker blue, is actually a bit lower than the averages in the NPI model, both for NCE simple and for NCE complex, and it's a bit higher than for drug repurposed, the complex. So this is total, and we can also see that it varies a lot for each phase of the development process. And we try to provide some insights of why this variation happens in each of the stage of development in our full research report. I just want to call attention that this is like 70 million, the total, so we are far away from the 2 billion figures that sometimes are cited for development costs. And we also conducted the interviews to try to explain better the data that we found, and also to understand what were some of the drivers, both within each specific organization, but also how they thought that the organization would compare to commercial R&D, to identify potential factors that might push either costs upwards or push costs downwards. And there were a number of factors that do influence costs, but we classified them as being undeterminate because they would affect both non-commercial and commercial R&D in the same way. So regarding costs, we identified 12 factors that would interfere with costs, 3 factors that would push costs upwards for non-commercial R&D initiatives, 5 factors that would push costs downwards, that is, that it would cost lower, and 4 factors that were categorized as indeterminate. I won't have time to explain these factors in detail, so we do explain them more what we mean by each one of them, and also provide selective quotes from the interview to try to make the point clearer in your full research report. But just as an example, for instance, one of the factors that were mentioned that would potentially push costs higher for non-commercial R&D initiatives is the fact that sometimes they have to build the infrastructure to conduct training and the clinical trials itself, especially for trials being conducted in low and middle income countries where most of the neglected diseases are endemic, and these trials are usually conducted in those settings. Also, the involvement of affected community in product development that would also potentially increase the costs, and limited scientific understanding of the diseases that they work on that would actually need to be better understood before you can actually start the product development process. Some of the factors that might push costs downwards, make it cheaper for non-commercial R&D initiatives, is the type of technology that has been argued that to be simpler for non-commercial R&D. We've seen that now a number of organizations have started to develop more complex technology as well, but they started with simpler technologies. Also, the trial location in low and middle income countries can also push costs down, especially regarding staff costs to conduct these trials. Organizational costs was pointed out as something that would really differ between non-commercial organizations and commercial organizations, especially in terms of salaries and overheads and other kind of infrastructure. It's also easier to show efficacy over the standard of care with smaller trial size for some of these neglected diseases. So that would also potentially reduce costs and, of course, lower input prices for non-commercial non-profit organizations are sometimes, well, organizations conducting clinical trials such as CROs might be willing to make a discount price for non-commercial R&D organizations. So now moving to quantitative data. We also sought to collect data, for time frames for the development types for NC simple and NC complex in preclinical phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and total development times. We see here the data points that we had, which is quite small compared to the data points built into the P2I averages. So we also ask you to keep in mind that our data set was quite limited, but we can see that overall in total it's quite similar. The development time would be a bit shorter in the data that we collected compared to the commercial averages in the P2I model. And the same for NC complex. They would be roughly the same in total times, again, with some variation by phase. The qualitative data also help us to understand these data, the qualitative data better. And we identified 12 factors as well that would be relevant for timeframes. 7 were likely to make timeframes longer for non-commercial R&D. 5 were categorized as indeterminate, and 0 factors were pointed to drive timeframes shorter for non-commercial R&D initiatives. So one thing that really came out very strong in the interviews was the lower availability of funding that sometimes can increase the pauses between one phase of the development process and the other phase of the development process for non-commercial R&D initiatives. So that would increase the development times overall. Also longer time to negotiate access to candidate compounds, especially when it has to be negotiated with commercial organizations. There was also the time to build capacity in low and middle income countries, and the smaller organization scale or less mature organization conducting clinical trials. Undeterminate would be, for instance, the need to develop regimens of multiple products rather than single products. That would actually take longer time to do, but it would be the same for commercial or non-commercial organizations trying to develop regimens. The duration of the treatment and or the disease progression, and also the seasonality or the prevalence or incidence of the disease, that it makes it more difficult to recruit patients for the clinical trials. Now moving to attrition rates, sometimes this is also referred to as success rates or failure rates. It's basically the rates how the percentage of projects that start one phase and don't move to the next phase, that's a failure, or the projects that move to the second phase if you are using the opposite success rates. Our quantitative data was not sufficient to generate any analysis. It was very limited, and we actually found that most of the non-commercial R&D initiatives did not have this data available or did not have the practice of calculating such rates. So further research is still needed in this area. But the qualitative data did help us to understand some of the factors that can be important for organizations conducting R&D process regarding attrition rates. We identified 9 of those factors, 3 of them that were likely to push attrition rates higher for non-commercial organizations, 5 that were categorized as indeterminate, and 1 factor likely to push attrition rates lower. So for example, what would make a project fail less in non-commercial organizations is lower pre-existing standard of care, which makes it easier to demonstrate benefits of a candidate product. What would make them fail more is, for instance, again, the limited scientific understanding of the disease that can make it fail more, especially in the early stages of product development. And the limited availability or use of clinical trials optimization tools. Some of the factors that were pointed to us and we classified as indeterminate as the type of the technology or product being developed, as the specialized literature shows there's a huge variation of attrition rates according to the type of technology, testing for multiple indications that can make one project potentially fail for one indication, but work for another one, and differing non-commercial versus commercial reasons for attrition. For instance, commercial organizations tend sometimes to stop projects based on market analysis, not only on scientific reasons. So overall, a summary of our results, we found that the quantitative data suggested that non-commercial R&D for new chemical entities is largely in line with P2I averages regarding total costs and timeframes, which important variation by phase. The qualitative data identified more reasons why non-commercial R&D costs would be lower than commercial R&D. Timeframes would be longer and attrition rates would be equivalent or higher, though the magnitude of the effect is not known. So our overall emerging hypothesis is that the direct costs of non-commercial R&D are expected to be equivalent or somewhat lower than commercial. Timeframes are expected to be equivalent or somewhat longer, and attrition rates would be equivalent. So just a few words of conclusions before we open for Q&A. Some of the limitations of the study, as I mentioned, we had a small non-random sample size. We had a short period of time in which the study was conducted. We recognize that respondents may have incentives to report costs, timeframes, or attrition rates that were favorable to their organizations. We try to see public available data to compare to the data being sent to us by the respondents, but the data available in the public domain was very limited, or it was only in very aggregated levels and was not possible to match it with specific projects. We did not compare the patient population level equity or health system benefits offered by the products emerging from non-commercial versus commercial initiatives. And we also did not analyze potential portfolio management role that lots of the PDPs plays as system integrators. So this has been pointed out in the literature as something that differs a lot. The quality, I mean, the characteristics of the products are developed by PDPs comparing to another non-commercial R&D compared to commercial R&D. And we do have another forthcoming paper where we try to analyze a little bit more the effectiveness of the PDPs and other non-commercial R&D initiatives for neglected diseases to try to shed some light into these questions as well. But this study, we did not look into these questions. Some of the merits, there was almost no prior literature focusing on costs, timeframes, or attrition rates of non-commercial R&D initiatives. So we see this paper as generating hypotheses for future testing against a larger sample of quantitative data and also of qualitative data, if we can interview a broader range of organizations, and also as providing intuition regarding reasons underlying any significant difference between non-commercial and commercial R&D initiatives. And once again, our emerging overall hypothesis after all of these studies that non-commercial R&D is comparable to commercial initiatives in efficiency, as indicated by direct costs, timeframes, and attrition rates. This is just where you can find the published study that, as Shuri mentioned, is open still for undergoing peer review, and also some of our underlying quantitative data and qualitative data. And here is our forthcoming studies. And if you want to make sure that you hear from us once it's available, please do subscribe to our newsletter dedicated to access to medicine and innovation issues at the Global Health Center. So thank you very much. I stop here and I look forward to the debate.
There you have it, folks, 100 pages in 22.5 minutes. Thank you, Marcela, for the excellent and very time-sensitive presentation. We have a lot of questions that have already started coming into the chat, so I'm going to start with a couple from the chat, and then we have one hand raised by Silvia Ferracci, so I'll turn to you after the first two chat questions. I want to start maybe with a couple questions on methodology, as we've gotten a few on that. So we had one question about from Alex Kong on the low response rate from the organizations to whom you sent the surveys. What do you think is behind that? And could funders be a different route to getting some of this data?
So you can see the full list of the organizations that we reached out to. Of course, we had a huge database of organizations working on this field. There was like over 250 organizations. So we tried to select the ones that had products either already brought to market or in the later stages of development, try to gather as much as information as we could. Some organizations just did not respond, and some organizations did respond, but with very limited data, or were willing to share qualitative data, but not quantitative data. And it was also a very short time that we had to conduct these studies, so that might also have influence in the response rate. And we did classify the organizations in 5 groups. One of them being others involved in the field, including some of the funders of some of these non-commercial diseases. So that was a route also that we tried to follow. They were willing, or they have availability of data more in interviews to share insights than actually quantitative data. So we explain more the methodology and the organizations in the full research report.
Great, thank you. We had another methodological question that I think is probably on the minds of many, from Reinhard Huss, about how costs are accounted for in commercial versus non-commercial R&D. For example, in commercial R&D, you might have opportunity costs that are included, whereas in non-commercial, you might not. How did you in the study handle this? And if you want to go back to the slides, of course, feel free to do that.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I have any slides that help with that question specific, but yeah, in the full research report, we try to explain better how we dealt with the data, both for cost, but also for timeframes, because the way that we calculated development time is a bit different than other studies available in the literature. But as we were looking at individual projects, we were not looking at the full portfolio at the organizations. We basically only had the data for those projects itself. We did not receive the data from the organizations in a level of disaggregation that we could actually see what were included or not. So it is their own way of calculating R&D costs. We tried to ask these questions in some of the interviews so we could understand better. But the data that we received, the figures was not disaggregated to see what type of costs they actually were including or not. This is, of course, a big limitation of the study. We did conduct a literature review on R&D costs of pharmaceutical development, where we go a little bit more into the different methodologies used by the different studies available that can help to understand some of the difference in the ranges. So we see lots of them actually include opportunity costs or the cost of capital. Some of them include like 50% of opportunity costs, while other includes like 5%. So there's a really huge variation. For commercial R&D, we know that they also lots of time include like the cost of marketing of the drugs that are non-commercial R&D would probably not have these costs. So it's really a huge variation of how these costs are calculated, and we hope to provide more information on that on our literature review that's available in the knowledge portal.
Indeed, and I think it's worth just reminding folks of the big variation in the actual numbers for R&D costs, where when analysts include, well, when they do include opportunity costs, you see huge numbers at the end, and in the hundreds of millions to billions of dollars. And when you exclude opportunity costs, the numbers come down more to what we see in the P2I model. So the comparison in this study was without opportunity cost, basically. And I think that indeed Marcella has very kindly reminded us of the resources available at the knowledge portal.
Yeah.
Let me turn to the floor. I think we saw Sylvia, you had your hand raised. Let me see if I can figure out how to allow you. Sorry. For some reason, maybe Zishan can help me. For some reason, the hand raising, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to authorize someone to speak. Ah, here we go. Sorry. Yes, please, you have the floor.
I think she lowered her hand. I can't see
Okay.
hand up anymore.
Okay. Okay, Sylvia, if you'd like to come back and let us know. Let me turn to a question from Lindsay McKenna on cost variation among PDPs. Did you see a lot of variation between different organizations? What reasons might there be? And I think she mentions leadership as being one possibility. What did you see in the data?
Thank you, Lindsay, for that question. We actually, our data set was aggregated and anonymized to protect or the participant organizations from being identified, because that was given the small amount of organizations and also the small amount of data that was shared with us. We were expecting to see some variations among them, but we are unfortunately not able to share the individual projects or the individual organizations data at this point, because that was a requirement for ethical committee to actually be able to conduct this study. But yes, there are variations between the organizations as well, and also for each type of technology, as I mentioned.
Okay. We had another question from Mike Frick on, could you say a little bit more about the costs of community involvement? That was something that you flagged as something that might drive the cost of non-commercial R&D up. Was that related to community advisory boards? Did that affect the timelines? Maybe you can just share a little bit more from the interviews and what people said about community involvement.
Yeah, of course. And I invite you also to read the full research report, where we actually provide some of the quotes explaining each of those factors, those included, that also help to understand what the interviewers meant by each of the factors. But yeah, that was one thing that was pointed out to us as both interfering with costs and also with timelines. It was pointed out as something good, like it should be done to involve more the community that are affected by the diseases in the clinical trial design from the beginning, and also sharing with them the results and making sure they participate in every step of the process. So it was classified as something positive that was actually done more by non-commercial organizations than by commercial organizations, but it had associated extra costs and extra timelines that came to actually to develop, to design the clinical trial design, and to make sure that all the relevant stakeholders were involved in the process.
If I could just add one thing that I remember coming up in the interviews was that for a lot of commercial firms, this is not something they're used to doing, with of course some exceptions, but in general, this is something that commercial firms relied on PDP partners often to help with when there were, for example, collaborative development projects. So it was considered one of the areas where PDPs had comparative advantage, I would say. We had a question from Justino Adesso, who asks why were vaccines excluded from the analysis?
Oh, sorry, I might have gone through fast to that slide. It was because the data that we received from the participant organizations was not enough to be aggregated or anonymized, as there are significant less number of organizations working on vaccines or on diagnostics in this field. We could not aggregate the data in a way that would secure the anonymity of the participant organizations. So we excluded that from more quantitative data, but the qualitative data does include also other type of technologies, including vaccines, diagnostics, and drugs.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have a question. Let's see, these might come a little bit later, from Aidan Hollis about the cost of capital. And I would summarize it as why would nonprofits not have a cost of capital? Wouldn't nonprofits also care about when services are delivered? So this question of the time value of money, I think, is what Aidan is raising.
Yeah, well, we do think, and it also came up in the interviews, that there might be a cost of capital, but that was not so relevant for non-commercial organizations and also to their funders, as the source of funding is usually different from for the non-commercial initiatives and the commercial initiatives that actually have to provide a return rate in the investment when they, especially in the earlier stages of development where there is venture capital involved and other types of funding that actually required a higher and faster return in the investment, so that it would be less relevant, the cost of the capital in the total costs, than it would be for commercial organizations, even if they might have some.
Okay. Thank you. Lots of questions coming in quickly. I'll try to get to all of them. You're doing a great job of being very concise in your answers. We have a question from Derek Ambrosino, who asks whether we compared commercial and non-commercial programs for similar diseases or technologies, given that there's big variation by therapeutic area, for example, rather than just averages.
Yeah, no, we didn't. We used mostly averages. I mean, as I said, our study population is focused on organizations conducting R&D for neglected diseases, but the parameters against which we compared for commercial R&D that are the assumptions building the P2I model, they come from historical R&D for all diseases, not only neglected diseases. We do know that there is a huge variation also according to indication. So that's, of course, one of the limitations of our studies. We thought just to compare to averages using what the parameter that we thought was more adequate to conduct this analysis, given the database that was used, but we could not do this direct comparison. Yeah, so that's also a limitation of the P2I model itself. It mostly works on averages, but as I mentioned, each archetype has different averages, so it's possible to adjust by each specific type of technology, not per indication, but they do have also a range. So even if we used averages, and when you actually run the model, you use mostly averages, there is a range that actually they identified, giving like the low range and highest range. So you can also account for some of those variations.
Okay, great, thank you. We have, I think, two comments from Silvia Ferrazzi, who put them in writing. And the first was commenting that there's not enough emphasis on the fact that there would be a lot of research that would not happen into neglected diseases if it weren't for the PDPs. And the second is that PDPs are often de-risking costs for commercial partners, and so this would actually reduce costs all around. And it's maybe PDPs and commercial R&D are not necessarily apples to apples, I think is the key point she's raising. Anything you wanted to say in response?
Yeah, we tried to include some of those concerns in the limitations of our study, because this was a short study and we were just trying to respond to one specific question of the whole R&D process, which we all know is much more complex than the picture we are presenting here today. So I did point out as one of the limitations the fact that we did not analyze the characteristics of the products that are actually being developed. We know from some of the information available in the literature that this is an important characteristic of non-commercial R&D initiatives, especially those working in neglected diseases. So this is a relevant factor, but we did not account for it in our research because our data set was not, and our study was not designed to answer to that question specifically. And we also pointed that sometimes that the limited scientific understanding of the diseases, for instance, especially because there's not much information available because it's a neglected area of research, is a factor that might push both development times, attrition rates, and costs up for non-commercial R&D. So of course, I mean, pushing costs up in itself might be seen as something negative, but that's not the main message that we are trying to say, is that is actually that it's of course necessary to do that, even if it takes longer and it costs more. Someone has to do it, and it's usually non-commercial R&D initiatives that are going to do it, given the smaller market incentives that are available for those diseases areas. And also just one limitation that I went very quickly in the end of my initial presentation is also this role that you mentioned in your questions of de-risking, potentially de-risking risks, the involvement for the private sector or commercial R&Ds that usually come in later stages of the product development. So most of the PDPs and also other non-commercial R&D initiatives involved in neglected diseases, they usually focus more in the early stages, and then they partner with most of the time commercial organizations also to conduct the late stages of development once they know that the product is more likely to be effective. So yes, they do play this role. And also it was pointed out to us by a number of the interviewees, this portfolio management role that most of the PDPs play as system integrators, that they actually have an overview of the portfolio of different organizations, and that allows them to have a look at the data of the pipeline from different stakeholders and select only the ones that are more promising to actually move forward in the development process pipeline. So that overall, if we look at the portfolio effects, that would probably drive costs down, as it would avoid unnecessary costs in products that are more likely to fail. That would also help with attrition rates, as it would make that only the ones that are more promising go to later stages of development, and also might help with shorten the pipeline. But the data that we collected was not designed or was not sufficient to actually draw these conclusions because it was focused on individual projects. It was not focusing on portfolios of one entire organization, or it was not also focused on this portfolio management across multiple organizations.
Thanks. I think we have time to take maybe 2 or 3 more. There was a Question that came from Philippe Carteron de Balmont about whether you could compare orphan drug development, which would be commercial, to neglected disease drug development, which would be largely non-commercial. I'm not sure if I've understood your question correctly, but what would you expect to see from that kind of comparison? And I remember in the lit review, there have been some interesting studies actually on orphan drug costs and timelines. Perhaps you could comment on that.
Yeah, so of course, in this study, we only focus on neglected diseases. So we do not make any comparison with orphan drugs or any other type of drugs in this specific study. But based on other research that we've been doing, especially on alternate business models and orphan drugs being one niche area where more alternate business model have also been involved. Well, I allow myself to make some comments and then Surya also please feel free to jump in. I'm not sure if I agree with you that orphan drugs are mostly developed by commercial organizations. So that's also something that we see several stakeholders involved as well. But of course, there was a number of specific incentives that were put in place by laws and regulations to increase the participation of the private sector in orphan drugs development. And those incentives draw to this area a number of for-profit, especially large pharmaceutical companies. I would say that as we see also in other areas, they are not necessarily involved in the early stages of product development, but there are lots of merger and acquisition happening in the later stages where commercial firms, especially bigger ones, buy or just merge with smaller organizations that are conducting early stage developments. Of course, there is also smaller companies doing R&D for profit. So we are not talking about only big pharma, but usually the incentives or the amount of the returns that the smaller organizations require is less than the ones that the bigger pharmaceutical companies would require. So that also affects like what we have seen in terms of costs of orphan development drugs, and also in terms of how sometimes blockbuster drugs are being developed based on orphan drugs incentives by slicing up multiple indications. So there's a number of things going on in the orphan drugs field that we won't have time to go into detail here. But yeah, in the literature review that we did both for costs and a separate one for timeframes and attrition rates, you can find a number of studies that were actually looking more in depth at the orphan drugs rare diseases question, and you can find information about how they compare to other areas available in these studies.
Okay. Thank you. I promised everyone Marcela was one of the most knowledgeable people on this subject, and I think you're getting your money's worth. So I think maybe we can take some of the earlier questions that were a bit more forward-looking and broad. And there was an earlier question from Carolyn Sunners, who asked whether you were surprised by the hypotheses that emerged from the data. Were you expecting, for example, non-commercial costs to be lower than commercial?
Surya, I might ask you to reply to this one. I mean, I can reply, but you do it much nicer than I do.
Yeah, I would say for me, there were lots of surprises actually, and that's usually a sign of an interesting and worthwhile research project. And I would say that I was surprised by the overall, if you take all three hypotheses together, I do think that many people would have expected non-commercial R&D to be much lower than commercial, and it is much lower than some of the estimates that we've seen out there. The big estimates that you see, you know, in the billions of dollars, non-commercial R&D, I mean, our figures, as you can see in our charts, were much lower than that. But when you look at other estimates that look just at out-of-pocket, direct out-of-pocket costs, you know, then, which is basically what we see in the P2I model, and by the way, with much larger data sets, the numbers are quite similar. So I do think that's surprising. On the one hand, many people may have assumed non-commercial would be much cheaper. They probably would have also assumed it would be longer, less efficient. I mean, this is maybe a stereotype that's floating out there. And you know, our hypothesis is not actually that they're less efficient, that they're equally efficient. I think the big caveat to all of this that Marcela really emphasized at the beginning is this is a small data set. And I think our biggest challenge is this is a small data set. And partly it's because not everybody responded, as Alex highlighted, but partly it's because there actually haven't been that many initiatives compared to the size of the commercial sector. So if we think about, you know, this is a very small, these are niche areas. There haven't been that many initiatives, and there haven't been, and not for that long either. So if we think about how many projects have been carried out over the last 20 years for which the data even exists somewhere in the universe, it's actually quite a small number. And so this is a really nice segue actually to Alexandra Fulham's question. She highlights that indeed, with the limited time frame, that would probably limit the amount of data we get, because PDPs are being asked for this information quite a lot, and flagged that there are 3 other studies that are currently ongoing on this question. So we look forward to seeing the results of those 3 other studies. I hope those will be published and the data shared as soon as possible.
Perhaps we should have mentioned that there were other organizations also using the P2I model to analyze their own portfolios. Some of these studies are already available in the literature, and then you can find more detailed information about each of the specific organizations that use the P2I model to analyze their own portfolio.
Yes, I might squeeze in a question from Eloan Pinheiro, who asks about whether, in terms of the costs, were the costs of partners included, for example, the costs of public partners or private partners who might be working with the PDP.
Hi, Eloan, great to see you here. Thank you for your question. Again, I would highlight that the way that we build our questionnaire for collecting the quantitative data, we did not ask for disaggregated costs. So we do not know what type of costs the organizations actually included in the R&D costs or not. I would say that, well, based on some of the interviews as well, that they do not include costs from partners. It's their own costs. But I can't reply to that question based on the information that we received from the respondents with yes or no direct question. I just wanted to highlight, I'm not sure if I understood your comments properly as well. I mean, we did try to include also organizations of more public nature in your participants selection. So we also have partners coming from the public sector or academic institutions that were kindly agreed to share their experience and their data with us.
Perhaps one final comment to make is that in the qualitative research, one thing that became very clear was there's huge variation across PDPs and within PDPs in terms of what exactly is the involvement of public sector or private sector partners for any particular candidate. So you might have a candidate where those costs are almost all borne by the PDP, or another project where some of those costs might be borne by the private sector. You might have in-kind contributions that are monetized. I mean, basically a private sector partner might put a number on the in-kind contribution, or they might not. Lots of variation in how they do that. But I think to come back to it, and the earlier comment from Silvia Ferrazzi, I do think for some of the projects, it did appear that PDPs were perhaps de-risking or lowering costs for private partner. For some of the other projects, the PDPs seem to be carrying out the research mostly in-house, doing it themselves. So again, lots of different ways in which any particular organization will manage a particular project, and even variation within. in organization. Okay, so we've come to the end of our time. Thank you so much to Marcela for handling a really terrific set of questions with brevity and and deep expertise. I think if you wouldn't mind putting up the last slide. Thank you again to all of our participants for terrific questions and comments, all very helpful as we revise and finalize the paper, as I said. We
Which
wanted
one?
to, yes.
Which one? This one? The forthcoming? This one?
Yes, thank you. Oh yeah, yeah. Actually, I was going to announce the next webinar, which I almost always forget, and today I remembered, but we already announced the next webinar. My mistake. So let me just say thank you to everyone. We will end right on time. Please join us on April 29th to talk about lessons from COVID for antibiotic R&D. And until next time.
This one.
Please fill out our survey.
Thank you. And once again, we remind everyone that the research is still going peer review. So please don't hesitate to send us any comments, questions, suggestions that might help us improve our analysis of the data. So thank you very much, everyone.